the day my son-in-law stood on my porch with a suitcase in each hand and that same smile he'd used at my daughter's wedding, the one that never quite reached his eyes. I looked at him and said, "Come in," and I meant it, but not the way he thought I did. Let me back up, because if I start there, you won't understand what those 2 words actually cost me, or what they were about to cost him. My name is Estelle. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a high school English teacher in Columbus, Ohio, and another 4 years after that tutoring kids whose parents couldn't afford after-school programs. I am not a dramatic woman. I don't chase conflict. I've buried a husband, outlived 2 sisters, and raised a daughter mostly on my own after my husband Clarence passed from a heart attack when our girl was only 9. So when I tell you that what happened over the past 2 years nearly broke me, I need you to understand. I do not say that lightly. My daughter's name is Faye. She was the kind of child who made strangers stop and smile. Curious about everything, always bringing home stray animals and broken things she wanted to fix. When she was 16, she spent an entire summer teaching herself guitar from library books. She didn't have her father's patience. She had her own kind, quicker, more stubborn, but she had his heart. Soft in ways she tried to hide. She met her husband at 26. His name is Leonard. He worked in insurance, he said. Sales. He had an answer for everything, that one. Always the first to speak, always the loudest laugh in the room. He told jokes that went on 3 minutes too long and watched to see who kept smiling. I noticed that. I filed it away. They dated for a year and a half. He proposed at a restaurant I'd never been to, somewhere with dim lighting and a menu without prices. And Faye called me from the parking lot afterward, crying happy tears. I told her I was happy too. I was, partly. There was something about the way Leonard looked at me when I asked him questions, not nervous the way a young man might be nervous meeting his girlfriend's mother. More like he was calculating, deciding how much I was worth knowing. I pushed that feeling down. Mothers do that. We tell ourselves we're being overprotective. We don't want to be the reason our children pull away. The wedding was small. Just family and a few close friends. I paid for the reception hall and the catering because Leonard said his side was going through some things financially. My daughter wore a dress we found together at a consignment shop in Clintonville, and she looked like the most beautiful woman I had ever seen in my life. I cried through the whole ceremony, even cried when Leonard read his vows, which he'd written himself and which went on for 7 minutes. For the first 2 years, things seemed fine. Faye and I talked on the phone every Sunday. Then the calls started getting shorter. Then they started getting rescheduled. Then one Sunday I called and Leonard answered and told me Faye was resting and he'd have her call me back. She didn't call back until Thursday. When I asked if everything was okay, she said she'd just been tired. She laughed a little when she said it, the kind of laugh that means don't push. I didn't push. I should have. By year 3 of their marriage, I was lucky to see Faye twice a year. Leonard had taken a new job, or so he said, that required them to move to Charlotte, North Carolina. I drove down for her birthday, and Leonard spent the whole visit finding reasons to be in whatever room we were in. He never left us alone, not once. I noticed that too. Then one Thanksgiving, Faye didn't come at all. Leonard said she wasn't feeling well. I offered to drive down and take care of her. He said that wasn't necessary. I asked to speak to her. She got on the phone for 4 minutes and told me she was fine. She sounded like someone reading from a script they'd only half memorized. That was 5 years after their wedding. I didn't see my daughter in person for 14 months after that. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I handled those 14 months with grace. I didn't. I called too often. I sent letters. actual paper letters because that was what my mother did and I believed it still meant something. I drove to Charlotte once without telling anyone and sat outside their apartment building for 45 minutes before I made myself leave. I don't know what I was afraid of. I think I was afraid of making things worse. Eventually, Faye told me, over the phone in a voice that had gone flat in a way I didn't recognize, that she needed space. That Leonard felt I was overstepping. That the calls were stressing her out. That she loved me, but she needed me to respect her boundaries. I sat in my kitchen after that call with the phone in my lap for a long time. I want to be careful here because I know how easy it is to make yourself the hero of your own story. I asked myself hard questions in those months. Was I overstepping? Was I holding on too tight? My sister Roberta told me I needed to let Faye come to me in her own time. My friend Nadine, who'd raised 3 sons, told me the same thing. So I stepped back. I stopped calling every Sunday. I sent a card on birthdays and Christmas. I gave Faye the space she'd asked for. The silence almost swallowed me whole. What saved me, honestly, was the house. Clarence had left behind a modest life insurance policy. Not a fortune, but careful money. I'd added to it over the years, invested conservatively the way he taught me to. When I retired, I sold the house Faye had grown up in and moved into a smaller place out in Westerville. Nice neighborhood, good light, a backyard I actually had time to tend. I had my garden, I had my book club, I had a part-time job at the library 2 days a week that kept me connected to something. I built a life without my daughter in it, and I told myself that was survivable. It was. Barely. 12 years passed. 12 years, 2 months, and about 11 days if I'm counting. And of course I was counting. Then one Tuesday in October, my doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen. I had flour on my hands from a pie crust I was attempting, the radio on, nothing special about the day. I looked through the window beside the door before I opened it, habit from living alone, and I saw Leonard standing on my porch. He'd aged. Hair thinner, jaw a little softer. Still that same posture, though. Chest forward, chin up, like he owned whatever ground he was standing on. Faye was standing half a step behind him. She was looking at the welcome mat. My heart did something I don't have a word for. It wasn't joy, and it wasn't relief, and it wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was like being handed back something you'd been told was gone for good and not knowing yet whether it was broken beyond repair. I opened the door. Leonard spoke first. He always spoke first. He said they'd been going through a difficult time. He said he'd done a lot of thinking. He said family was important and they wanted to reconnect. He said they'd had some financial setbacks and were in between situations, and was there any chance, just temporarily, just for a little while? Faye hadn't looked up from the mat yet. I looked at her and said, "Come in." Now, what I need you to understand is this. I had not been idle in those 12 years. About 8 months before Leonard showed up at my door, Faye had called me from a number I didn't recognize. She was whispering. She told me she only had a few minutes. She said Leonard had been making financial decisions without her, moving money, taking out credit in her name, things she'd only started to piece together after a friend from work showed her something on her own credit report as an example, and Faye had gone home and pulled hers. She said she was scared. She said she didn't know who to trust. She said she was sorry. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. And I meant that with everything in me. After that call, I sat down and I did what Clarence used to call getting ahead of the weather. I called my attorney, a woman named Ellen who I'd used for my estate documents and who I trusted completely. I told her what Faye had told me. I told her about the years of isolation. Ellen referred me to a private investigator she knew, A quiet, thorough man I'll call Mr. Graves, who had spent 20 years doing financial investigations. He didn't promise me anything dramatic. He just said he'd find out what was real. What he found was extensive. Leonard had a history. 2 previous relationships before Faye. One that ended in a disputed joint bank account. One that ended with a restraining order the woman had eventually let lapse. He had opened 3 credit cards in Faye's name in the past 4 years. He had been slowly transferring money from their joint savings into an account she had no access to. And here was the part that made my hands shake when I read it. He had on 2 separate occasions made inquiries about my estate. Not subtle ones. He'd contacted a title company about a property search connected to my address. He'd spoken with someone at my bank, someone who no longer worked there, about account structures for elderly relatives. He'd been watching my finances from the outside for years. Waiting. I read that report at my kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not calm exactly, more like clarity, the kind you get when you stop waiting for something to make sense and finally accept that it never will, and what you're left with is just what you're going to do about it. I called Ellen. We put some things in motion. Then I waited. When Leonard showed up on my porch in October, he thought he was walking into the house of a lonely 67-year-old woman who'd spent 12 years missing her daughter and would give nearly anything to have her back. He wasn't entirely wrong. He just miscalculated what nearly anything meant for a woman like me. I let them stay. Leonard had a story about a job falling through. Plausible enough, vague enough. He talked about their apartment lease ending at a bad time, about just needing 60 days to get back on their feet. He was charming about it. I'll give him that. He helped with dishes, asked about my garden, told me the pie I'd been making when they arrived was the best thing he'd eaten in months. I watched him case my house. I want to be precise about that word, because it's the right one. He'd walk through a room and his eyes would go to corners, to the bookshelves, to the filing cabinet in my spare room, to the small safe I kept in my bedroom closet that I'd never mentioned to anyone. I saw him notice the safe through the cracked door one morning when I left it open while I went to answer the phone. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Meanwhile, Faye and I were finding our way back to each other. Slowly. She was quieter than I remembered, more careful with her words like someone who'd gotten used to measuring them. But in the mornings, when Leonard was still asleep and she'd come into the kitchen and I'd pour her coffee, I could see her, really see her, underneath the careful. She was still there. My girl was still in there. One morning she told me quietly that Leonard had asked her to find out where I kept my important papers. She said he'd framed it as wanting to help me get organized, to make sure things were in order for my sake. She said she hadn't been able to sleep since he asked. I reached across the table and held her hand. I said, I know. She looked up at me. You know? I've known for a while, I said, and we're going to be okay. Both of us. But I need you to trust me for a little longer. She was quiet. Then she nodded, that same stubborn nod she'd had since she was 4 years old. About 3 weeks into their stay, Leonard asked me to sit down with him. He had papers. He framed it as estate planning. Said he'd been talking to a financial advisor friend who'd flagged some things about my asset structure, said he just wanted to make sure I was protected, said it would be so much simpler if certain things were consolidated. If I added Faye to accounts now rather than waiting, if I signed a general power of attorney just to make things easier going forward, he had a pen ready. I looked at the papers. I looked at the pen. I looked at Leonard. And I said, you know what? Let me have Ellen take a look at these first. You remember Ellen, my attorney? I just feel better having her eyes on anything I sign. Old habit. Something moved across his face. Gone in a second, but I caught it. He said, of course, absolutely, no rush. I called Ellen that afternoon. She called me back within the hour. She told me to move ahead. The following Tuesday, Leonard came downstairs to find two people in my living room he hadn't met before. One was Ellen. The other was a woman from the county sheriff's office, out of uniform, who had been working with Mr. Daniel Graves on the financial fraud documentation for several weeks. There was also, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, a social worker from a local family services organization that works specifically with people in coercive control situations. There was also Faye, standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room with her arms crossed and her chin up. Leonard did not take it well. He went through several versions of himself in about 4 minutes. The reasonable man, then the injured husband, then the man who decided I was a controlling mother who'd manipulated his wife. He said things I won't repeat here. He picked up the papers he'd tried to get me to sign and said I'd never understand what he'd sacrificed for this family. I said quietly, I think you should go get your things, Leonard. He left that evening. The legal process that followed is ongoing and I'm not able to speak to all of it. What I will say is that what he'd done to Faye's credit, what he'd done with their joint accounts, and what he'd attempted with my finances, none of it went unnoticed. None of it went undocumented. Mr. Graves is very thorough. Faye stayed, not in my house forever. She's not 19, and I raised her to be her own person. But she stayed through the winter. We watched old movies on Friday nights and argued about which ones held up. She started seeing a counselor in January, a woman she found herself and drives herself to every week. She's been talking about going back to finish the degree she'd put on hold when she married Leonard, environmental science. She'd always cared about that kind of thing, even as a kid, always worried about the creek behind our old house getting polluted. She still has quiet mornings. She still sometimes starts a sentence and then stops herself and has to decide all over again whether it's safe to finish it. I don't rush her. I just keep the coffee on. A few weeks ago, she came into the kitchen and sat down and looked at me across the table and said, "Mom, I'm sorry it took me so long." I said, "You came back. That's what matters." She said, "You could have closed the door on both of us when we showed up." I thought about that for a second. Then I said, "I almost did. On him. Not on you. Never on you." She reached over and put her hand on mine, same as I'd done with her a few months before, and we just sat there for a while, with the morning light coming through the window and nowhere we needed to be. I want to say one more thing, because I know some of you watching this are going to have questions. Some of you are going to think I should have turned Leonard away at the door. Some of you are going to think I was too easy on Faye, or not easy enough, or that I should have called the police sooner, or called them later, or handled any piece of this differently. Maybe. I am not standing here telling you I did everything right. I made mistakes over those 12 years. I called too much. And then I went silent when I should have kept trying. I was so afraid of pushing Faye further away that I didn't fight hard enough for her when she first started to disappear. What I know now, what I wish I could go back and tell myself in that first year of silence, is that the most dangerous thing I did was tell myself it was okay to stop being her mother. I dressed it up as respecting boundaries and giving her space and trusting her to find her own way. Some of that was real, but some of it was just fear. Fear that if I pushed, she'd tell me she was done with me. And I couldn't face that, so I backed off instead of finding a smarter way to stay close. If you are a mother out there who has lost contact with a child because of a partner who cut you out, I'm not telling you to storm the door. I'm not telling you to make ultimatums. But I am telling you this: do not go quiet. Find a way to leave a crack in the door. A letter. A birthday card. A text that says only "I love you and I'm here." Because the day my daughter called me from a borrowed phone and whispered that she needed help, the only reason she called me, the only reason she trusted there was still something to call, was because I had never fully stopped. She knew I was still there. I'd made sure of that. And that, more than anything, more than Mr. Graves and his reports, more than Ellen and her documents, more than the look on Leonard's face when he finally understood the kind of woman he'd walked into the house of. That is what I'm most proud of. I kept the light on. For 12 years, I kept the light on. And my daughter found her way home.